So today we're going to begin the very first edition of the Fascist book series. I'm looking very forward to this, and just to begin, I'm thinking about doing this putting a video out on Fascist books for about a week. So every week I put a new one out is what I'm thinking I'm going to do, because I like the idea of taking the time of that week to reread my Fascist books and kind of get that information down to you guys, why you should get the book, what's in the book, what's the thesis of the book, the importance of that book, so that you could possibly go buy it yourself. And also to help people who want to get into fascism, who are fascists themselves, to actually understand the core principles of the ideology. And the Fascist book series that's really its main goal. But I thought I would just state that very quick, that I'm going to do it once a week. I may break it. I don't think so, though. Or if you want me to do it, every maybe two Fascist book videos a week. I don't know. It would depend on the feedback, but that's my plan right now. So, of course, we're going to begin with the Doctrine of Fascism, and you should see it on your screen. This is the one I have, which is published by Howard Fertig Press, and I got my copy from a college store. Oddly enough, college bookstores used to have the Doctrine of Fascism for sale. I know they have the Communist Manifesto for sale, but I bought mine very cheaply. However, I want to begin that to get into fascism, you need to read the Doctrine first, and you need to get this version. This version is the best to me, and I'm going to go into that right now. One is it's organized very well. You have the fundamental ideals, all written in kind of the paragraph form. And then you get into the political and social doctrine, which is very well organized. And most second of all is you get into the appendixes. For some reason, the online copies of fascism that I could find on the Doctrine really don't go into the appendixes. And that's a very big problem. Most people, when they read the Doctrine, they just read the fundamental ideals and the political and social doctrine. But the problem right there is you're not reading the appendix. The appendix gives you more of explaining of the ideals of the Doctrine. It's more notes, more dialogue on it, which is better. And also, it explains the context. And this is something that everyone who's been studying fascism knows, that the context is no longer there. Left-wing commies will call right-wingers fascist. Right-wingers will call left-wingers fascist. But they never define what a fascist is. And the answer is pretty simple. They really can't. Because the communists will go and say it's just degenerative capitalism. The capitalists will go and say it's just a heresy of socialism. Again, this really shows that people understand the dialect. They see it as a dialect. Again, that's good with, maybe contrasting capitalism and communism, but it's not really going to work for fascism, because fascism is a third way. It's not capitalistic and it's not communistic. However, one problem that I have with people who pick up the Doctrine is they don't understand the context. And one of the things that gets me very angry, and why you should pick up this copy from Howard Fertig Publisher Press, is because the Doctrine, the ideal of the state in fascist Italy, is totally different from the concept of the Anglican American spirit of what the state is. The Italians are very different from being either English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Canadian, American, Australian, New Zealand. there's a big difference there. And one of that big differences is language. You always see people say, what's that quote? Fascism is a mixture of corporate power. Something like that. This is totally nonsense. In fact, all the major historians of fascism, and even in the Doctrine of Fascism, doesn't even have that. A third reason why you should get this is because he goes into the fascistic conception of capitalism. Here it is. Fascism should be more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. When people hear that in the Anglo-American sphere, they immediately think of the modern-day conception of corporations and their conception of the state. That's totally different from the Italian conception. And the problem is people don't get to the Italian. They don't want to understand what the Italians thought. It's just what we think. This is false. You can't do real history like this. You can't. It won't work. And most of all, it's dishonest. And it's intellectual laziness. However, going back to, it gets into capitalism. When I was rereading this, there was something that stuck out to me. And it was Mussolini saying that capitalism actually did work. There originally was not a problem with capitalism. And he gets into his conception of the 3 periods of capitalism, and then he goes on to how capitalism went into a de-evolution state and became super-capitalism, which, interesting enough, he goes and states that all it is really state capitalism is just state socialism reversed. And I think that's actually very powerful, because we can see that right now in the real world. And the fourth reason why you should get this book, The Heretic Figure Pressures of the Doctrine of Fascism, is because it has 2 speeches on corporatism. One from 1933 and the other one from 1934, when Mussolini started to expand more on the ideal of the corporatist system, which, by the way, corporazione is the Italian word for it, which means guild. So again, in English, a guild is totally different from the modern conception of a corporation. Something that people don't want to know. However, in his speeches on corporatism, he not just gets into capitalism and socialism. He gets into more of a, if you will, metaphysical problem. He sees that Europe is declining, that the fascist movement is more than just spiritual, or really more, it's not a materialistic thing, which again, a fascistic complaint of capitalism and communism, or they just call it liberalism for the capitalists, is its materialistic basis of its worldview. In fact, he goes into foreign policy, 4 Powers Pact, Locarno. Then he talks more about the corporations, its economy. And then he gets into again, another reason why is he gets into the conception of the state within the Italian mindset, which is totally, as I said 3 times already, totally different. And so you need to read the doctrine a lot. A fascist has to know the doctrine almost by heart, but he needs to know the context more than anything, because a lot of people pick it up and they say, yeah, it's got some interesting points, but it's a lot harder to understand. And that is true. That is, I think, the greatest con of the doctrine of fascism. It's actually much more complex and harder. Though, in my view, I would say because it's more complex, reading the doctrine of fascism, it's ultimately superior than, let's say, the Communist Manifesto. Because the Communist Manifesto is very clear. It wants the workers of the world to unite, to overthrow all nations, borders, religions, conceptions of tradition. That also means monarchy, by the way. conceptions of what they called feudalism and then capitalism and its historical dialectical materialism, which the doctrine of fascism really attacks, and attacks it very quite well. And then it gets into its conception, which is actually much more harder to understand because it is more complex. Another thing about the doctrine is that you'll find that people will say that it's, for example, I've heard two good complaints. One complaint was that when you read the doctrine, you're getting something better than when the first fascists started off with the manifesto, but it's still more complex. And as I said, this is very true. Another complaint I heard is that, well, the doctrine's very good at attacking capitalism and communism, but its solution is bad. I would say to that argument that the solution technically actually isn't bad. It's just that you have to understand that he's writing this in a different context from our time. Though with some of the same ideals, many fascists will look to the doctrine, rightfully so, as, where its universal ideals are written form. And this is very true. The doctrine is, it's been spread all around the world. People have read it around the world. And of course it influences many people who read political theory. And the doctrine has, if I had to pick 10 books of political theory, the doctrine would be in that list. And I would say reading the doctrine, every fascist should come away with that it's both a revolutionary ideal, but also a reactionary ideal. You're not really just getting revolutionary conception of economics that's totally opposed to capitalism and communism, but you're getting something that's a lot more harder and mixed, concrete, but also it is also a social revolution, and at the same time very reactionary. Of course, knowing the context, Italy was a weak period after the First World War. The monarchy was in trouble. The oligarchy was in trouble. The military, of course, depleted after the First World War, had problems. And of course, the industrial problem was huge. And the fascists came up with very reactionary ways and revolutionary ways to fix this. And most people, when they read it, they want to say, okay, is it left wing or right wing? Every fascist or someone who wants to read and understand the movement needs to know that it's both a reactionary and revolutionary thing. I personally say its revolutionariness was reactionary, and its reactionariness was revolutionary. And of course, out of the three main ideologies that came out in the 20th century, or 19th century I should say, liberalism on the one hand, Marxism on the other, fascism is the complete opposite of the two. It goes against their little streams of the conception of their worldview. And I would say, because of that, it's very reactionary. And it heads into very medievalist and traditional views, which in my view, you can be a medievalist or a traditionalist and espouse the doctrine, because it very much lines up with medieval ideals and even monarchist ideals of a society, of how the state should be and its economic system. And I think that makes the doctrine of fascism very interesting, and that it's so reactive, it's so revolutionary and reactive that it's willing to, you could use it because its conclusions are very good, and even its criticisms of Marxism and capitalism, to go back to more traditional forms of government. And I think that gives the doctrine of fascism an edge over the Communist Manifesto, for example. Another thing that when people read it, they have a hard time understanding. For example, I've seen a National Socialist who made a video talking about, well, fascism in Italy was just a political thing. National Socialism is something spiritual. Or I will hear from both the left and the right that fascism was against religion, anti-piety, and just for straight up Nietzschean ideal. This is totally false, or at least half true, half false. It's true that fascism and the doctrine does state some conception of Nietzsche's views. However, it's not anti-religion. And actually the doctrine states very clearly it's a spiritual, philosophical, and in the real world. Again, the doctrine and its fundamental ideal states right off the bat, like all sound political conceptions, fascism is action and it is thought. Action in which doctrine is innate, and doctrine arising from a given system of historical forces in which it is inserted and working on them from within. End quote. And so again, it is something that is both spiritual, material, philosophic, or mental. I would say it embraces Plato's conception of the person very well. One thing you should, when you pick up this book, is you should reread Mussolini's speeches on corporatism and the appendix really well, because there it goes into the ideal of why fascism is totalitarian, and it actually gives a very good answer, which in my view I don't think anyone could really dispute against it. And that is that whatever your worldview is, your ideology, even your religion, you cannot separate that from your life, from how you think, how you do things, and more importantly, how you think a political system should be organized, how your nation should also be conducted and organized. You can't separate that. And so, of course, fascism being as a symbol of the fasces, strength through unity, shows that it is something that's holistic. The doctrine is very holistic. It uses the word Catholic, by the way, which means not just universal, but not embracing, but holistic. Like the whole lungs. For example, we have two lungs in our body. One lung of our body could not make a human person. We would need two on the left and the right side of our body. And so fascism makes it clear that its conception of totalitarianism is more of a holistic conception. It isn't just, oh, well, we're going to take everything, we're going to kill people. No. Another good reason is that all fascists need to read the doctrine is that fascism does have a concept of the individual. The individual does exist in the fascistic conception of the world and of the state. Excuse me. It's not like how the Marxists would claim he's just one cog in the machine, or how liberalism and libertarianism says he's the end result of our political view. Fascism rejects this and makes it very clear that the individual is not isolated. He is a part of the system, and the system is a part of him. He and the state are one, unified. This is why the fasces is the symbol, because the symbol shows the unity of one person and another person and the entire group together. Now, a lot of people will say because of the fasces, fascism is, and the doctrine expounds, as they would say, collectivism. This is not the case. It's very clear here that fascism is proclaiming a more medieval conception of society. For example, in the medieval world, there was a conception of the individual and a conception of the common good. Everyone, the greater. Fascism is no different, and the doctrine expounds that. Because remember, the doctrine is not expounding collectivism, which is more. Collectivism really is just by groupthink, group togetherness by force. If you want to look for collectivism, you go find that in communism. Fascism makes it very clear that that's not its conception, and it actually rebukes that. So, the individual does have a place, and it is very important. And I'm going to read in the appendix, appendix number 7, the individual and liberty. I'm just going to read a quote from it. Quote, "We were the first to state, in the face of democratic liberal individualism, that the individual exists only insofar as he is within the state and subjected to the requirements of the state, and that as civilization assumes aspects which grows more and more complicated, individual freedom becomes more and more restricted." End quote. Quote, "In the fascist regime, the unity of classes, the political, social, and moral unity of the Italian people is realized within the state and only within the fascist state." End quote. One more quote here. Quote, "In our state, the individual is not deprived of freedom. In fact, he has greater liberty than an isolated man because the state protects him, and he is part of the state. Isolated man is without defense." End quote. So, I really can't say anything bad about the doctrine of fascism. I think it's by far least respected, least appreciated, and misunderstood political doctrine that I have seen or even read of. I think the doctrine is very good, both its criticisms and its solution. The one con that I will say is that the doctrine doesn't really... I wish there was more written into the doctrine, because you really could add a lot into that. For example, it would be good to see if you could make a theological argument for a fascistic state or government. Though the doctrine proclaims that, though the fascist state and fascistic conception of the state doesn't proclaim a state theology, it's not against theology, and it does believe that theology should be involved within the fascist as a person and the group in thinking what is the best common good. Another thing that I forgot to mention is dealing with its universal aspect. The doctrine of fascism gives kind of a clear universalistic conception of what fascism is. However, it makes it clear that things like the IMF, the UN, the League of Nations at the time this was written in the 30s, isn't something a fascist can be involved in. Because fascism rebukes all internationalistic systems of control and of not thought, but also of action. For example, the IMF could get involved in your economy, could change its interest rates. Of course, we get into the concept of usury there, and its fees. However, it could also go against the nation if the state and the nation is not fans of the IMF, which ultimately would destroy, for example, Italy, the Italian economy, and hurt the Italian nation, and the Italian people, both as a group, a community, and as an individual. In fact, the doctrine of fascism states that it prefers the term community instead of collectivism, because community is more of a social contract, where you all come together based on a common language, common culture, common tradition, common national identity, and race, for example. Race would be one of them, though that in the doctrine it doesn't expound on the concepts of race, or very much ethnicity, or even anti-Semitism, as we all know. So, I'm going to conclude here. I see I'm in 24 minutes in, and I'm looking forward to this fascist book series. And I would really like to hear feedback on this, because I want to know if I'm too ranting and rambling, if I'm not organized enough, if you would prefer me to organize it on certain levels of way to compress all the information down. Would you prefer me to bring up many quotes, or would you just prefer me to hear pros and cons? I'm still trying to figure this out, though I'm very happy that I'm doing it. So I'm just going to end it now. Thank you very much for listening.